There's a point in your life when the things that have happened to you just become stories. I don't mean that they're less important or that they didn't happen, but they just turn into a thing that had happened once. No matter how much it affected you, it's just a story. Even if you're the one who survived. 5 years ago, when we were 15, my best friend Annie and I decided to go trick-or-treating one more time. I know we're probably too old and the adults in the neighborhood would roll their eyes when we showed up, but we figured they would give up the candy because kids our age were more likely to mess with their house if they didn't get free chocolate. Andy and I weren't like that at all, but it didn't make us less likely to embrace the idea. Free candy is free candy. Being of that age when lazy becomes an art form of itself, Andy and I weren't just going to go out to find that we were getting crappy stuff like butterscotch candies, or the sort of stuff that you see in your grandma's candy dish. Leave that for what our parents did. This is the digital age. If you know what to look for, and with even basic social media skills, you can actually get your route mapped out for you in advance. Even 4 years ago, kids were all over Twitter posting pictures and putting up hashtags where the really good candy was. It's probably more Instagram now. We looked for a hashtag full size, which sounded like a good idea at the time, but also led to more than a few pictures of dudes naked below the waist. It wasn't a foolproof way to find candy, but it worked at least a little bit. We were able to find a neighborhood not too far from Andy's house that had 4 different stops with full-size candy bars. We each had 3 different masks, you know, the cheap thin plastic kind that get held onto your head by an even cheaper and thinner piece of elastic or rubber. They were only $1 a piece at the local dollar store, and we got more than that back in chocolate just from those few houses. Sure, by the 3rd time the parents got the clue, but what difference did it make? By the time we actually went out, only about an hour had passed until most of the houses were turning off their lights or blowing out their candles and the pumpkins. We went out a bit later than other kids, because we were older and of course, that meant we couldn't be out at the same time as the little kids. Andy was scrolling through Twitter, trying to see if there were any other houses close by that we could hit up, and he wasn't having much luck. I was looking through what had turned out to be a pretty epic haul, when he nudged me with his elbow and held out his phone for me to see. "Hey man, there's one more," he said, his voice muffled behind his white skeleton mask. I looked at the screen and saw a picture of 3 full-size Snicker bars and a picture with the hashtag, full size. Andy scrolled his thumb across the screen and showed the address. It was about 2 miles away, which, where we lived, meant that it was out in the middle of nowhere near the edge of woods. "Dude," I said, "that's way out there. We won't even get there before they go to bed." And he shook his head. "Nah man, check it out." He kept scrolling his thumb to all the people who had replied to the picture. No one was going out there. Everybody was saying that it was too far away or too creepy or whatever. If they went through the trouble of getting full-size candy bars and barely anybody showed up, they're for sure gonna wait up. I bet it's some lonely geezers who just want people to remember they're alive. I hesitated. I really didn't want to go that far out. It was cold out and I watched as the thick clouds of breath came out from behind Andy's mask. 2 miles? I asked. And he proceeded to goad me with some of the more off-color insults I'd ever heard. None of which meant anything to me until he pointed out that if no one was going there, then they probably would just give us a bunch of candy without having to do the mask routine. Finally, I agreed. If nothing else, it would make a good story. We could make it sound even better. Maybe even live tweet it and see if people could make it go viral. We talked about doing that the entire walk there. How we could make it seem like we were in the middle of a scary movie. Going up to the house. Hashtag creepy. There's some weird music playing inside. Hashtag WTF. Just that sort of thing to get people paying attention. Even if they were asleep, we could take some pictures or something and make it seem like a big deal. What else were we going to do? Except we had forgotten most of that by the time that we got there. The house was even further back in the woods than I thought. The start of the driveway seemed about a half a mile from the road to the house, and there was a slight bend in it, so you really couldn't see the house beyond a light that was in one of the windows. We didn't stop at the road or anything that dramatic. We had been walking that far, and I think as much as we had excited ourselves at the idea of the Twitter thing, we were also tired and just wanted to get the candy and go home to watch some scary movies. As long as the driveway was, it felt like a fast walk. I didn't take my eyes off of the door from the moment we could see it. There was just one light on inside of the house. I think it was a garage light and it shone out into the side window, so you couldn't actually see anything inside. There was a carved pumpkin with a flickering flame on the stoop, but it was really poorly done. Like a little kid or some old person with palsy tried to make it. And there was a lock on the door. I don't mean like a deadlock, but one of those little 5-button things that you can see attached to doors of houses that are for sale. See man, old people, they keep that thing on there in case they lock themselves out or something. And he said in a tone that didn't sound all that sure, but it sounded good enough to me as my arm reached out to press the doorbell. The sound of the ding-dong had barely stopped when the door cracked open. Andy and I stood there, not a single word between us, as we stared as what we could only assume was a man in the doorway. He was about average height, a little overweight, but he was wearing a weird mask. It had squinting eyes and really fat cheeks and a puckered mouth like it was trying to hold its breath. Behind the man was a single exposed red light bulb that backlit him. He just stood there, wheezing with each breath behind the mask, as it slowly turned back and forth looking at each of us. I'm not sure which of us spoke first, but eventually we remembered to say trick or treat. The man stood there for at least another minute before looking back between Andy's skull mask and my fox mask, and then turning around and walking deeper into the house. Andy and I looked at each other. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I imagine they had the same confused, terrified look as mine. When we looked back, I could see that the man had picked up a box of candy bars. As he slowly turned back to the door, his arm hit a railing and he grunted as the box flew out of his hands, and the candy bar spilling out onto the ground. A few actually slid to within a foot of the door, and the man grunted and cursed as he bent over to pick them up. Andy and I didn't move from where we were on the front step until the man turned around. He was on his hands and knees picking up the candy bars, and Andy nudged me, pointing at the candy that was just inside the door. I think I shook my head, but I can't remember. A moment of panic overtaking me. I just wanted to leave, so I reached inside the door to grab the candy. The man's back was still turned and I knew I could just grab a bar and we could take off running, splitting up if we needed to. Why he would chase us, I had no idea, but we were pretty worked up at that point. It all happened in a matter of seconds. As my hand touched the smooth, cool wrapper of the candy bar, I felt a vice grip clamp down on my wrist so hard I thought it would break. The man had spun around in place and grabbed me. He had been way closer than I realized. Something about the light of my mask messed with how well I could see him. In one smooth motion, he tugged my arm and I went flying into the door. But as soon as he pulled me past him, my body falling to the ground like a lump, he lunged at Andy. Something flashed in his hands. Andy had turned to run and suddenly crumpled to the ground. The man stood over him, still breathing insanely loud, his breath a cloud in front of his face. I was trying to get up as he turned and I saw what was in his hand. A taser. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up again, outside of the house. My body ached and my head was killing me, and my face was cold too. I realized that I wasn't wearing my mask. I looked around desperately for Andy, but I was all alone. The front door to the house was closed, the pumpkin was gone off of the front step, and the lights were off. I scrambled to grab my phone, but that was gone too. I was just about to start running when the panic shifted in me and I realized that Andy might still be in the house. Yeah, he could have run away, but what if he didn't? As quietly as I could, I went around the house, trying to look into the darkened windows, but I couldn't see anything. I was too scared to knock on the door. I mean, it wasn't a prank. That son of a bitch had used a taser on Andy. When I had almost done a complete lap, I thought I saw something moving in the dark. I cut my eyes on the window and I almost passed out as a fat, round mask burst towards the window, thumping the forehead against the glass. I let out a scream and it just stayed there, staring at me. And then I looked down at the side. And next to him, I watched as something white lifted into view. It was a skeleton mask. Andy's skeleton mask. And there was something splattered on it. Something red. I ran. I ran until my legs gave out and I tumbled against the first house I found that had all the lights on. I was gasping and crying and begging them to call the police. By the time the police had got up to the house, there was nothing there. No man, no Andy. All they found was a splintered door frame from where the back door had been kicked in. I hadn't even noticed that in the dark. If I had, maybe I could have done something instead of running away like a coward. I later learned that the lock was on the door because the house had been foreclosed on a week prior. The Twitter account that Andy and I had found was a week old as well. If we had bothered to look, we would have seen that the account followed over 1,000 people and had only 15 followers. All the tweets were retweets from other legit accounts except for the picture of the candy bars. It was registered in the name of a kid who went to a nearby middle school. But that was just a lie to throw people off. To lure someone in. I cried as I told the strangers whose house I ran to and what had happened, begging them to call the cops. I cried when I told the cops and my parents what had happened. I cried as I tried to understand why any of it had happened, why he had let me go, and why he only took Andy. It's been 5 years since Andy disappeared, and there's been nothing, no response. Every year I sit on Twitter and I look up the hashtag, full size, checking everything out, making sure it isn't a lie or another lure. I've called the police more than a few times thinking that I had found the guy, but mostly, I'm just looking for my friend, so I can stop telling this story and start living my life again. The life that I lost the day Andy disappeared. All for a full-size candy bar.